Good morning, DevOps Pro 2020 Europe. Thank you so much for joining us and kicking off what is day number two of a really exciting online virtual event. My name is Steve Boone. I'm the head of product management at HCL Software. I'm really excited today to be your kickoff and keynote. A couple of housekeeping things that we wanted to run past you guys. If you don't know already, we've got an extremely exciting and busy day planned for you. There's over 25 various different talks. So what does that mean? It means for you, you get to customize your own agenda. Make sure you're checking out the website, looking at all the great talks that are going on. One of the things we'd like to remind you is that we are using the Slido app for a question and answer session. So if you can, go over to slido.com, use the event code DevOps 2020, and then make sure you choose your right hall. And once you're there, you can ask or vote for questions that you like the most. There are very different polls options that you can do, but in general, it's a great place to hang out and get your questions answered. So, with that, let's get on and talk a little bit about DevOps. The conversation that we're going to be having today is around value stream management, and I think it's a pretty timely talk because, especially as we're sitting in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis. A lot of the challenges that we have are understanding how can we, as practitioners, developers, managers, executives, make sure that the work that's going on in our organizations is overall aligned to our business goals. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is making sure that we can get that alignment. And even more importantly, understanding what kind of metrics can we look at to help make sure that we are doing the right things, that our DevOps initiatives are strong and healthy. So let's just jump right in. I hope you guys enjoy the talk. Feel free to ask questions, and we'll be answering them towards the end or throughout the day as we go again over at Slido. So let's start talking about the types of initiatives and goals that are out there, right? I like to think of it from really two perspectives. One is, what are business goals? And in today's day and age, businesses have some pretty obvious goals, but I think they're important to talk about. One, obviously, we want to be profitable, right? So that means we need to make good quality software. We need to put it in customers' hands. We need to be able to solve business problems. But we also want to be trusted, right? Your company wants to be a reliable source. And so when we talk about, well, what does it mean to be trusted? Well, for us and a lot of our companies, that has to do with security, right? We want to make sure that we can be trusted with people's credentials, their credit card information, personal information, whatever that might lead to. We want to be a trusted source, and we want to be responsible with that data. We also want to be, as a company, risk adverse. We don't necessarily want to take huge chances. We want to take calculated risks. We want to be risk adverse for the most part. And so, how do we start to avoid risk? Well, we look at our quality, right? We want to make sure that we have solid uptime, that we're not, we're pushing out more features than we are defects to our customers on a regular basis. But then we need to correlate that back to development activities and development initiatives. And for a lot of teams today, they're looking at efficiency, right? How do we work and communicate better, especially as we're working from home? How do I communicate with somebody that I used to be able to just spin around in my chair and say, hey, have you seen this code review yet? So how do we become more efficient? Also, how do we get better quality, right? Instead of just talking about it and doing test-driven development and bringing the next testing framework and spending development cycles on automated testing, how do we actually do a quality initiative and hold ourselves accountable to it? And the last is security, same kind of thing, right? There's tons of things that we can do as development organizations to improve security and make sure that the code that we're doing is tested and secured and tested often. And so these are the types of things that businesses say that they want to do, development teams aspire to do. How do we make sure that they're aligned? How do we make sure that we keep these initiatives healthy and strong? And I think when we start talking about why these things fail and why companies often struggle to do this, there's some basic challenges that we want to discuss, right? The first number one challenge is that these types of initiatives, these goals, they're not easy. They take a long time to do, right? And they take a long time to ramp up. So if you think about your own organization or the place that you call home where you work, how many different development teams are there? How many different applications? And to go around and say, as a business, these are the quality initiatives, these are security initiatives that we want to instill on you, that we want you to strive for. Not only do you need to get those teams involved, they got to get on board, and they got to be able to ramp up. And when you are a busy organization, it's easy to lose steam, right? a week from now, 2 weeks from now, a month from now, another big challenge is going to pop up. There's going to be other fire drills that are going to be going on, and all of a sudden, teams are doing other things. They're not as focused on these initiatives, so they slowly start to sputter off over time. The second challenge is that it's hard to get all of these teams on board, and it's even harder to know who's committed and who isn't. So if you think about the really large organizations out there that might have, thousands of different applications, well, how do you start to know which application teams are actually doing the things that you want them to do? Are they actually spending more time testing their software? Are they creating more tests? Are they running them more frequently? Are they running their security scans? Do they even have security scans? And how would we know, right? So it's very challenging to know, like I said, who's going to be committed and who's not. And then the third one, these three levels, it's not like they're all created equal. So, a new startup team that might be doing, cloud native development, and perhaps they're doing and building microservices. They might have an easier time, just getting started and implementing quality standards, and security standards. But it's very difficult to go to a mainframe team and say, "Hey, we need you to go add a bunch of these different additional security checks." So, based on the different levels of maturity, you know that you're going to have a lot of inconsistency across the organization and adoption of these. The fourth challenge we see is that a lot of organizations struggle to recognize when teams are doing the correct things, right? And it's important that we're capable of rewarding our high performing teams, right? When we find and identify people and teams that are doing what we expect, we should raise them up culturally within our organization. We should celebrate those actions and we should reward them and we should set them as an example for other teams to follow. Which brings me to my fifth point. It's very difficult for an organization to capture best practices, right? We can see when things work well. How do we then communicate that to the rest of an organization and say, look, this is working over here in this part of the organization. These are the things that they're doing. This is what value we're seeing in it, and we want to make this the new common practice. So this is what makes getting that alignment so difficult. There's these kind of five core challenges, and one of the biggest things that we talk about when these challenges are that a lot of them have to do with just lack of visibility, knowing who's doing what, when, and where. So if you're familiar with the Phoenix Project is a great example, right? Talks very much about making work visible. And that's exactly what we're talking about a lot when we talk about value stream management is how we can make work visible. Now, there's really two kinds of work that we often talk about, right? There's planned work and there's unplanned work. And unplanned work presents a whole nother set of common challenges, right? So let's talk about these. When we talk about planned work, right? Planned work's great because the expectations are clear and usually the end result is known, right? Someone has created a story, it's sitting in our backlog, we know what we want to get done. And a lot of times the effort is accounted for. We know who or whom is capable of delivering that work. And the other maybe obvious thing about planned work is that hey, it's usually in our prioritized backlog. Like so, as a team, we've discussed it. It's easy to track. We got a ticket already created for it. It's got points assigned to it, and usually that team that's assigning those points have us agreed upon how that work is going to get done. So there is a known entity. We can talk about it. We can discuss the pros and cons. We know where things might go off the rails. And then overall, these things in the prioritized backlog, if our product managers are doing their jobs, these things are aligned to business goals and top priority. So planned work is great. Where things come off the rails, especially when we're working remotely, is unplanned work, right? Unplanned work is really one of the things that can cause unalignment between a business and a development org very quickly. And so why is that? Well, unplanned work takes away the development team from their planned work. It's quite obvious, right? And we won't know. Nobody planned the unplanned work. That's the whole point. We don't know how long it's going to take. There isn't a clear known end goal, and it will drastically impact important metrics, things like lead time and cycle time. We'll talk about those a little bit later, but unplanned work really hampers these statistics. As I mentioned, no clear definition of success, and there's a really big risk of scope creep, right? Think about is it if you're a developer when you get pulled into those L3 support meetings and you're working with the customer, and next thing you know, you're helping them a little bit, and then you're helping them a little bit more, and the next thing you know, you're setting up a whole new process for them. And so that really can take away from your day-to-day work, and there's no great way to track that. And because there's no great way of tracking it, we really don't know what your time and effort is, and therefore there's a whole lot of unknown cost. So unplanned work in general, really huge challenge for getting things done. And there's really, I think, four different main points when we talk about unplanned work that we want to think about, right? Usually, unplanned work, it's unexpected, right? And unexpected projects really impact the team's ability to deliver on a roadmap. So if they're driving along, we think about how many points we might be deliver in a particular sprint. Well, as a team, after a while, if we've got good kind of cohesion working together, we know what we can deliver. We know exactly what we're going to deliver on. When that unexpected work comes in, it really starts to shake the ship a little bit. Two, unplanned work is extremely difficult. If you're a manager, if you're a product manager, you're a release manager, you have to answer for unplanned work. And it's extremely difficult to communicate up to the stream to upper management why things aren't getting delivered when you have to go around and say, well, we ended up picking up this project or we ended up picking up that project. And it starts to sound like excuses when in reality, a lot of this unplanned work is just the nature of the business of software development. You have to do it. The question is how do we get better at it? How do we start to actually track it? Right? The third part is unplanned work is really poor for culture, right? It can make working a miserable experience. As a developer, as an architect, you expect to be doing a certain daily routine. When unplanned work comes your way, it makes for unsustainable work practices and an unhealthy culture. And the last point I want to make here is that we got only so many things we can do as a development team, right? That's it. We can only get so much work done. So if we're taking in more unplanned work into a sprinter iteration, that means something has to go, right? And that usually will be something out of the planned work because that's all we can account for. So again, these are the things when we start talking about business alignment to our development initiatives, unplanned work, all the challenges I mentioned up front. This is where a lot of us lose our sleep. So, how can we get better at this, right? And if we want to get better at solving some of these problems, we really need to have more attention to detail. So, let me talk a little bit about some of the key detail points I want to bring up here. The first one is an organization, we need to strive to be able to track and report on quality and security initiatives, not just at a big global level. We should know them by team and by application, right? We want to know exactly what those teams are testing, when they're running tests, what are the quality of those tests, and we want to know if they're doing security, what kind of security, how often are they doing it, and it needs to be visible not only to that individual team so that they can track their own progress, but also to the business and ideally to other teams as well, right? There's nothing more than I think that drives a team than knowing what their peers are doing and knowing that they're setting a high bar and that people want to set that high bar as well. The second thing, we want to know what developers are working on. Is it planned or is it unplanned? It's really easy to track planned work. We've got it in a number of different systems, right? We think about the tools you're using today. You're probably using something like Jira or version one or ClearQuest. There's a number of different tools out there for tracking planned work. But there are also tools for unplanned work, right? I mean, think about where your support tickets might come from. And I'll use support because I think it's one of the easiest kind of unplanned scenarios, or at least hard to judge. Those things could be sitting in a Jira instance as well. So a lot of companies are using tools like Salesforce. So there is, as that work comes in, a ticket and a way to track it. And eventually, if we track it long enough, we can start looking at, well, how long does it take for us to typically close unplanned work, right? Or to resolve it in some fashion. So we need to be able to have visibility into what people are doing. The third one is we have to be able to start to identify bottlenecks, not just in our delivery, right? When we talk about DevOps, often when we talk about bottlenecks, we think about, well, where are the bottlenecks? And some people point to, oh, well, there's bottlenecks in our deployment process. There are bottlenecks everywhere. And I think, and, more and more the leaders in DevOps, the teams that have been doing DevOps for the last 10 years are saying, there's new bottlenecks forming. We need to be able to identify them. And a lot of those bottlenecks come from how we communicate with our other members of our development organization, how we communicate to cross functional teams that we're dealing with, whether that's designers, whether that's technical writers. And we want to be able to improve that and streamline those processes. All of these different bullet points really bring us into the core concepts of value stream management and what value stream management can bring to a business. So that's what this talk's focused on. I want to kind of jump into a little bit of an explanation if you're new to the concept of value stream management, what it is, right? In real simply put, it's not a new idea, right? Value stream management is a lean business practice, and in a software environment, it can help us estimate delivery efforts and resources, right? So we know how long things are going to take. We can plan and communicate better as an organization. If my managers come to me and say, well, when is the next release of the software going to be? I can very accurately tell them within, in a real precise instance of exactly what I think we're going to be able to deliver this certain feature set. So not only is it helping us plan, but it's also going to help us improve the flow of the value throughout the organization, right? What does that mean? Well, from idea, when someone has an idea, all the way from that idea turning into a physical, tangible feature for in our products in production for our customers, I want to be able to track that and figure out what's the fastest way to get an idea into customer value, right? And we want to do that the entire time while we're managing and monitoring the entire software delivery cycle, right? From end to end, right? So we're not just talking about dev to prod, right? That's pretty narrow. We're thinking idea all the way into customer value. So much broader than just simple dev to prod pipeline. So if we can visualize, right? The second part of this is we want to be able to visualize the value. So value stream, we're going to talk about how we get started with value streams, great ways to work with your teams and communicate about value streams. When we can start to visualize our value stream, now all of a sudden we can provide the visibility to all of the different teams that we're working and communicating with, right? That's going to allow us the capability of tracking our quality. It's going to allow management to enforce governance and security policies. And even more importantly, I think it allows everybody to quickly identify where work gets slowed down, right? Think about your daily stand-ups that you might have face to face when you were when you were going into the office more frequently. It was a great opportunity for someone to speak up and say, "Hey, I'm stuck on something. I need some help." And maybe it was because they didn't understand a technical requirement. But a lot of times for us, it was because they didn't know the business process to progress something. They were being held up by some other policy or some other thing that they needed to work around, and they needed some kind of intervention, right? Uh, those happen all the time, and when you're working remotely, especially, you have less opportunity to have those conversations, and those bottlenecks are even harder to identify within your own organization. So let's talk about how can we get into value stream? What does it mean to do value stream? Well, there's really two approaches. The first approach is the manual approach. It's not a bad approach. It's where the majority of the teams I work with start. You're probably already doing some of this today, but I think I can help you take it a little bit farther, right? The first steps I would recommend is you're going to want to whiteboard your current process, right? So what does that mean? And some of you might go, well, we're already doing Kanban today, right? So we already have some visualization of what we're doing. And that's totally fine, right? There's some pros to doing some things this way, right? If you're working through a Kanban board, the pros here are you can help the teams, discuss what work is actually being done. And this is good because that communication is what's really important and what's key. The communication is what's going to allow people to discuss where things are getting held up. But there's some challenges with just doing simple Kanban board, right? One, Kanban boards are updated in real time. If we're lucky, they're updated once a day, usually in the morning when people are coming in and they look and they're going, okay, hey, what am I supposed to be working on? Or I just finished this, so I'm going to move this one over, pick up another car. But there's other drawbacks as well, right? The Kanban boards are typically pretty limiting, and really focus on basic type statuses, right? To do, in progress, testing, done. They don't represent the full gamut of areas where work progresses. Take an example. Within our own development organization, we don't track work as just, hey, we need to do it. Hey, we're doing it. Hey, it's been tested and it's done. We test it, and we do a variety of things in between. There's two different layers of code review, right? There's areas where we're bouncing back and forth between design and development. There's sign offs. There's several different levels of different iterative, not only code reviews but testing that are done before we even get into actual QA, right? And so all of those areas, most people would just track that as in progress. Yeah, but in progress where? And who's responsible for that work at the time that it's in progress? That layer of granularity is just completely blown out the window when we're trying to visualize it like this. So this is a very good place to start. And I'm not running out and saying, hey, everybody go adopt Kanban. What I'm saying is sit down with your team, grab a marker and a whiteboard, and actually communicate every step that a work item, a ticket takes to make it through your internal process. Talk through and identify the cultural norms that you guys do, and write those down, validate them, kind of make everybody aware that they are part of that process. Now, if you haven't done anything like this, one of the things that we wanted to make available to you folks at the concert is this fantastic ebook. It will put together by myself and my team, help you and your teams get started on getting your feet wet into value stream management. So it talks about the different whiteboarding activities that I'm explaining to you right now. Wanted to throw this up there. You can go hclsw.co/enabling teams. It's free to get to pull this book down, and I encourage you, take it to your next stand up, pass it around to your different teams. Do this as a team activity, right? Do it in your next retrospective. That's a great place to start doing it, right? After you guys have kind of talked about what went poorly this week, where did work not go as smooth as planned, talk about how you can get things better. Talk about the idea of maybe creating a value stream and mapping it out. So I mentioned there were two approaches. The first approach was manual. The second approach is more of a DevOps approach. And so what do I mean by that? Well, we're in DevOps, we like fast feedback, right? And the idea of the manual approach is that there really isn't any fast feedback. It's once a day at best, and maybe that's okay for some organizations. Our team wants considerably much faster feedback than that. They want real time feedback. So the approach that we've taken and that we're trying to share with other teams out there are ways that you can go about in digitalizing your own current delivery process, right? How do you actually start to put all of the data from all of the different tools, your source code, your issue tracking, your CI/CD tools, your testing tools, your security tools, your monitoring tools into one place, right? And then how can you actually start to visualize everything that's going on and associate that to business value, right? There's a lot of integrations and a lot of things that need to be done to get there. But when we actually do it, the pros of this, the value that the business can get out of this, the value that your individual teams can get is astronomical, right? We get all of the benefits of doing it the manual way. Plus, we can take it, millions of miles further. We're going to have, like I mentioned, all of those various different integrations for real-time updates. We'll know when tests are running. We'll know how many tests. We'll know what the results of those tests were. We'll know who's running security scans. We'll be able to tie those security scans and tests to individual applications and teams, like we talked about earlier. We'll be able to identify things like unplanned work. And the best part about this is if we do it and we take this idea far enough, and really, I think that the next decade of DevOps is really shifting here, right? Is that we can start to leverage this data to perform intelligent gating. Right now in large organizations, when you're going to go release your software, there's probably some cab, right? There's some approval process that you go through, that the business goes through, where everybody gets together and says, well, convince me that this software is of good quality, convince me that it's in line with the business goals, and then we'll all vote and say, okay, yes, this thing can be released. What happens if we just used the data to solve that problem, right? Like we actually sat back and analyzed it and said, well, we ran all these tests, we've got all the approvals from all the places that we need, and we didn't have to pull everybody into 2, 3, 4 hour meetings to try to get software out the door. So there's a lot of upside, and this is what it starts to look like, right? This is an example of some of the data that we've done internally. Each one of these individual dots represents work, right? It's our work, it's our business value, it's the things that we embrace. So those different types of dots that are sitting there, the different color coded ones, they could represent things like features or stories and defects. And we've started to take this a step farther, where we wanted to say, well, can we start to track things like work in progress? How much work is our development team taking on at any one time? We have a very strong agile team, the ones that I work closely with. So they care about things like work in progress. They want to make sure, and they know that if they take too much work on, it's going to impact the overall throughput. And so this is just a cool way that we're trying to visualize some of this, by integrating a lot of these tools. And you can see that the things that we're trying to care about, the metrics that are what I think is the industry is pointing to, are things like lead time, things like cycle time, right? When we start thinking about things like, well, what are our automated tests and our code coverage? Are they? And it's interesting, right? When we talk about things like code coverage, if I come in the morning and I just look at the last build we did, I can see what the code coverage is. And that's fine, but that's like looking at a single tree amidst the forest, right? I don't just care about that one build's code coverage. What I want to see is, what's the code coverage doing over time? Is it trending up? Is it trending down? Are we getting better at code coverage? We're putting more coverage in there. What kind of incidents we had? We've got some teams that are starting to track things like NPS scores, right? We're a big software company. We sell a lot of software, and therefore customers are constantly scoring us on the quality of that software, and teams are held to high regards to try to get that NPS score as high as possible. So there's a million things that we could possibly go do once we start trying to aggregate all this data, many different ways that we can visualize it. This is the one that made most sense for us, and we're really just on the kind of beginning edges of this. So where do people start? Well, you could build dashboards, right? And a lot of folks out there are building dashboards. Many of you have probably looked at or tried using things like Hygia, right? Hygia is a great dashboarding tool, and dashboards are great, but the magic of what we're doing isn't in just reporting on the number of deployments that you're doing. The magic is in the relationships between that data and how it all fits together, right? So I want to talk a little bit about that. Um, when we want to start pulling relationships together, what we're talking about is taking all of the data coming from your individual tools and understanding how they fit together. So if we as a development team make a pull request, right, can we identify, well, for what work item in Jira is that pull request associated to? That one's pretty simple to go do. Then we can start to say, okay, well, what build is associated to this pull request? Okay, that's another meaningful relationship. And then when in that build process, you're probably doing a ton of really cool stuff, right? You're doing unit tests, code coverage, static analysis, you name it. All that stuff's getting done around build time. Hopefully, you're doing some kind of security scans on your code as well. And so now all of a sudden, if we can aggregate all that data and tie it back to that single pull request, now all of a sudden we're rounding second base, right? Heading into third. Now we know which deployment tools running the deployment. We can associate it to an overall release, and bingo, right? Now we're starting to get kind of that whole picture of idea all the way to business value. That's really what we're trying to capture here. And we're doing it with a number of different tools too, right? I mean, I just kind of to show you visually the things that we're using in house. But I think most importantly here is that you got to keep an open mind, right? This data, there are a million different tools. And again, one of the things we're even being pushed for now is to go farther to our left, right? Um, before things get into internally, we're using Jira. Before they get into Jira, we're putting, product managers are putting their ideas in tools like Aha, and they're keeping and managing their roadmaps in Aha. So, as a business, if you started saying, "Hey, remember we had that idea, 6, 7 months ago, and it's sitting in Aha," how long did it take before we had that idea, but then we actually created the stories or the epics, right? And then you can start getting into, well, how long before we broke those epics down into, tangible, deliverable, bite-sized stories for the development team. In too many times we're seeing organizations pointing the finger back at development and saying, well, you guys need to move faster. And I think what value stream is showing the business is that it's usually not IT. There are many other areas within the organization where even once you build and deploy the code, it just sits for ridiculous amounts of time because the business isn't capable of doing anything else with it at a faster pace. So these relationships will help us understand that and help us communicate that to a broader audience across the enterprise. One of the other views I wanted to show you guys real quickly about some of the different data and the way that these things are stacking up. We're starting to think about our different stages in the way we communicate work, right? We have several different backlogs. We have pointed backlogs. We have backlogs that don't have points, essentially prioritize, unprioritized. We're starting to build stages around things that are just incident related, right? So if we have a Sev one, or we know that we've got an outage of a particular applications, all of those monitoring tools create alerts. Those automatically are generating tickets for us in tools like ServiceNow. We get those to pop up on our own little dashboard so that we can see them and go and tackle them. So again, these are the different types of relationships that we're trying to build and kind of highlighting across the various different tool sets that we're looking to do it at. One of the cool things that we're doing here as well is we're trying to aggregate what we're calling a chain of custody, right? At any given time, wouldn't it be great if we could look at a particular work item and know exactly everything that's happened to it, right? Which tests ran, when they ran, who ran them, who made the code changes. If it wasn't an automated build, who fired off the build, who approved the deployment into what environment, what part of a release is it in, what version of the core application is it a part of. All of that information is extremely valuable when we're starting to try to address things like mean time to recovery, right? That's another key metric we'll talk a little bit about here in a minute. But mean time to recovery is you guys, I'm sure, know how fast can we fix something that's broken, right? Well, you need data. You need to be able to go back real quick and understand who's the right people to get involved. How do we triage it? Where's it at? And once we have that, we can go and make the tactical changes needed to solve the problem. So, quickly, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about business agility, right? So, we're talking about value stream and how the value stream can help us align our business goals and our development initiatives. And to do that effectively, we need business agility. So, I want to talk a little bit about what that means. The first thing it means is all businesses have risk, right? There's some risk associated with everything that they're going to be doing. And if we want to control risk, we need the other piece of the puzzle. We need governance, right? And so I'm sure in many of your organizations, there are several different governance type policies that people are enacting on a day-to-day basis, especially if you're in a regulated industry, right? I predominantly work with a ton of healthcare and financial services, a lot of large banks. All of them have a ton of I would say governance in place, audits that they have to go through, things that they care very much about. And so why are they doing these things, right? Well, they want to avoid the catastrophic incidents, right? And they're trying to do that by shifting these things left, just like earlier when we were, just fundamentally talking agile and DevOps, and we'd say, well, we need to shift testing left. Well, now, we're past that. People want to start shifting governance and audit left. They want to shift risk left. They want to start catching those things much earlier. They want to do compliancy, move it left. And so there's been much more focus on trying to move those things and identify who's doing what in those areas much earlier in the development cycle. Same thing about cost, right? Businesses care about cost. So if we care about cost and we want to protect cost, What do we have to have? We have to have stability. And what do we mean by that? Well, we're trying to minimize rework, right? When we have a lot of rework, we typically have poor quality. And so if we want to minimize rework, the number one thing we can do is reduce the number of defects that we have. And that will help us improve our change success rates. Right? And then the last one we care about as businesses is around revenue. I mentioned at the beginning of this, right? Businesses want to be profitable. And the number one thing that we can do as an organizations to help drive revenue for our companies is we can deliver. We can deliver quickly, right? That leads us to the concept of flow. And when we talk about flow, we want to be able to say how fast can we get through the organization, right? Now, and again, not just through development, not just through our automated processes, but through the entire organization. And so when we're talking about flow, we're talking about the capability that says, hey, can we dramatically reduce the time that we're thinking from idea to production while increasing productivity? That's another key point here, right? When we start talking about value stream, not only are we talking about improving the flow and the speed at which we do things, we're talking about increasing the productivity of our overall individual development communities, going back to how they track and manage and discuss their work on a day-to-day basis. So this whole concept of business agility, I think, really helps us pull all these pieces together into one cohesive unit. And it's this kind of connection of all of these different parts that's ultimately going to allow us to have better continuity, better alignment between the business and our development organizations. All right, earlier we talked a little bit about planned and unplanned work. And I think, here's some cool things that we're doing that I think if you guys start looking at your own source code repos, you might be able to dial some things up as well. One of the things we're trying to identify is how do we know when developers are working on something that's not planned? What does that look like? And from a technological perspective, from a digital perspective. And so, earlier I was showing you those various different graphics of all the stages and the different ways we're trying to track our work. We've come up with a little of our own way of starting to say what's planned and what's unplanned, right? And so, for us, when we see just a regular circle, we know that it's representative of a work item. And then we can do a number of different types of filterings that determine what kind of a work item it is. But the things that are really cool are the squares and the triangles, right? These are things that ideally, when I'm coming in and I'm looking at my team's value streams, I don't want to see a whole lot of these. Let's talk a little bit about what they represent for us. When we do this, a square typically represents a pull request that's not tied to a work item, right? So someone's going out, they want to make a change, they are making a change, but it's just not work that we have that's planned. Now, sometimes this is okay if you're a developer and you care, you typically like to refactor and clean things up. And in some effort of that is okay. In context, of course. We don't want people just going in there and changing everything just because they got a lot of free time. But we need to know what's changing. That's important, right? And we need to know why things are changing because that work has value to it and that time has value to it. So if we can start to identify changes that are essentially out of bound and not tied to work items, then as managers, as dev leads, as dev managers, we can have those conversations and say, hey, I just want to check, what are you working on? Is this the right thing that we should be spending the time on? Is the change you're making aligned to the business value, the business goals that we're looking to do? And a lot of times they are. But what that gets to is then if we're doing this work and this work was important, why didn't we have a story for it, right? Why wasn't it planned work, right? And that's the difference. This is a way that we're using as a way to communicate to our teams and say, hey, what you're doing is probably not wrong. And then generally, we trust our development staff. They're usually doing the right things. But how do we make that work planned work next time around, right? So when we have squares, these squares typically pop up. We'll take note of them, and then we'll bring that into our next retrospective and say, these were some of the things we did, right? Should we be accounting for these things in our planning next time around? And so we've gotten to the point now where when we saw some regular patterns of the type of squares that were popping up, that we just started planning for them and knowing that, hey, typically for a given sprint or iteration, There's going to be these types of scenarios where we're making pull requests that are somewhat related, but we don't have stories. What kind of fluctuation do we want to allow ourselves in that work? The ones that we really get concerned about, though, are triangles. Triangles are no-nos, right? Triangles are commits directly into branches that don't have pull requests, that don't have work items. Someone's just saying, man, this needs to go in. Now, there are times when we need these, right? Think about an emergency fix, something that needs to go right now. It's broken, it's down, fix it, put it in there. It's a last case scenario. We don't like to see it like that, but it's often sometimes a real world scenario. So when those things happen, we need to have a way of tracking and understanding who did the work, where it went through, and be able to visually show that this thing's now sitting, let's say, in production, and it didn't go through our entire value stream, right? It made it there. And the last one's alerts, right? We want to know when things grow stale. How long are things sitting? Things that are sitting are sad and boring. We want things to move. And ideally, if something is sitting, it should be communicated about. Why is it sitting? Is it sitting because we don't have all the requirements? Is it sitting because we need to go talk to a customer to better understand how we want the use cases to work? Is it sitting because we don't have the technical experience, the technical knowledge to go solve the problem? For some reason, if something's sitting, it ain't good. And so, this just gets down to the whole concept of, when we talk about DevOps at its core, you really need good, solid, agile skills to be able to do DevOps. Now, not to take that out of context, right? There are definitely teams that can embrace DevOps that aren't doing agile, but I think you'll have a whole heck of a lot more success if you are doing agile well. And so, again, this fast feedback and this understanding of when things are sitting, when people are working on certain types of items that are either planned or unplanned, when you're breaking the rules and just going straight and committing, and not having any care for the business or anybody's goals. We want to know about those things. We want to bring those things to the forefront, and we want to be able to communicate about them so that we can get better as a team. Right? All right. So here's some of the different types of metrics. In the lead up to this talk, I wanted to make sure I would cover a lot of the metrics that I think teams are trying to track and are starting to track with value streams, and things that I know we're very much tracking. Um, when we're looking at these various different sets of data, one of the really cool things that I think comes up is that when is as management teams and even development teams sitting and going through our own backlogs, prioritization decisions, things that we decide to go work on or not work on, they have trade-offs. And if you can see those trade-offs, you can actually start to manage them, right? So a great way to think of that would be if you can start to have some sort of a tracker for your unplanned work, and you can start to identify, spikes in your planned work versus your unplanned work. Now, maybe over the course of a couple of weeks, you don't have a lot of data points, but over the course of a couple of months, over the course of a year, you actually have a ton of data points, and you can find that, hey, maybe we when the back half of our sprint, we tend to have a whole lot of unplanned work. Maybe that means we should quit pulling in more work, even if it looks like the sprint's getting a little thin. All of those things you can actually start to have intelligent discussions around if you have the right data. So you can start to ask yourself things like, are we sacrificing quality, or at the sake of trying to go faster for the business? Right? The business is always going to push us go faster, deliver more quickly. But at the same time, kind of the unspoken thing there is, but yeah, we want it to work. We want it to be good quality. But they don't necessarily come out and say that, right? So we need to know if we're risking one for the other. Are our releases becoming more predictable, more frequent and predictable? When we bought into DevOps, a decade ago, the whole idea was that we would be able to release software more quickly. Are we? Do we have any way of proving that to the business? We know that automation, just because we automated it, we're definitely faster than we were. But is the business actually able to deliver any more quickly? That's the big thing that we don't know, right? For a lot of companies, the answer is no. They're more predictable because they have automation, but they're not necessarily any faster because they still have old, rigid governance processes in place. And so part of what we're trying to do in this value stream movement is say, look, we got plenty of automation. We've got plenty of data. how can we use that to help tie into the governance policies that we have to basically automate it a little bit more across the whole enterprise so that we actually can get out the door quicker. Earlier, when we talked about some of the challenges, we started talking about how do we start identifying high performing teams. Well, when you have the data and you can associate it to a team, it becomes pretty obvious which teams are doing great jobs and which teams need some attention and some love. And at the end of the day, one of the things I think that obviously the business cares about is are we actually delivering more business value, right? Can we start to look at our releases and understand if we're delivering more features than we are defects and actually solving our customers' problems? So, how does this all start to play off? Well, I want to talk and kind of transition a little bit into the various different sets of metrics that I find not only we're tracking, but a lot of our customers are tracking as well. Right. So the thinking around a metrics is evolving, right? And I put the little quote in here from the DevOps handbook. Work is not done when development completes. The reality is the work is done when we're actually providing value to our customers. So this diagram here talks about delivery speed, everything from an idea all the way to deploy and release. And when we look through kind of what we think about is our traditional agile metrics. They're predominantly right here in the agile dev and task, right? And we look at things like velocity, work in progress, and we look at burn downs. These are things that you can find in a lot of your agile planning tools today, right? You might be able to generate yourself a burn down chart in Jira, for example. Hopefully, as a team, you're tracking your work in progress. So this is where a lot of us started, and now we get to the point where we're starting to look at things like lead time and cycle time, right? And you'll find various different definitions for these. The way we think about it, and traditionally the way that I've discussed it with a lot of clients I work with, is that when I think about lead time, I'm thinking about the whole gamut, right? From the idea that the development team accepts that work and it's into their sprint to the time that it comes all the way down and we actually deliver it to the customer. Cycle time's a subset of that. It's a little bit shorter in a window, but at that point, it's the idea of when we actually started doing the development and then delivering it. So again, lead time, idea, something that says yes, development will take this on, all the way to value, and then cycle time is development teams actually working on it to value. Both of those things are good metrics because what we can really start to understand is just not what our cycle time is doing and how it's trending, but what's that gap between the lead time and the cycle time. And I think that's one of the interesting things that the business can look at and go, man, maybe we can do things a little bit better. Maybe we need to provide better, more clear requirements to development teams. But in this new model, we start looking at things like the number of deployments, what our throughput is, right? When I start talking about throughput, I start talking about, well, what are the types of things we're delivering? Are they features? Are they bugs? Are they defects? Are they stories? Are they tasks? Where did we spend our time? And then what's our change in success rates, right? So any of these different areas will have a phase cycle time. You'll spend some amount of time in each one of those phases. So how long, think about everything that has to happen when you're delivering software. You need documentation, right? You need something. Someone's got to download the stuff and figure out how to use it. You're going to need design. There's design that needs to go on as part of that development work usually. So again, a single story bouncing between all of these different groups. How long did it spend with those groups? We want to track that because that shows us as practitioners what to expect. And I think one of the biggest things that it does for us, again, not only just visualizing the work so we know where it is, but it creates a sense of empathy, right? And I think that's so important for our DevOps cultures these days is to just have a little bit of compassion that this isn't easy, right? Making software in a large company and delivering on time has a lot of challenges to it. Some would argue that you're kind of set up to fail. So having a little empathy, knowing what other groups are dealing with, understanding that if you give something over to the design org, it might take 6 or 7 days for it to come back. So, as long as everybody's on the same page there, it makes it a lot easier to have that conversation instead of somebody just coming over and going, why isn't this done? Well, It's with design. Well, when are we getting it back? We gave it to them 2 days ago. On average, it takes 6 days to get back. Like, it just helps facilitate and have a general better understanding of how the entire business works. That's the thing about DevOps. We always say it, it takes a community to raise a child. It takes an entire enterprise company to buy into DevOps to really do true continuous delivery, right? So we need everybody to understand and have that empathy across. Some of the other things, and again, I borrowed this from our friends at the State of DevOps 2019. This is the Accelerate report that they put out there. Um, these kind of four key metrics are what we see the whole industry kind of gearing around and focusing on. Deployment frequency is a big one, right? People want to actually say, are we able to deploy on demand? Are we doing it once or twice a day, right? There's various different breakdowns that this chart will give you that you can kind of pinpoint and say, oh yeah, we're either a low, medium, high, or we're elite. But I think what's more important is not, it's important to know where you're at, but I think it's more important to know why you're there, right? And that's the beauty of value stream, is that you can understand and the business can start to understand why you are what you are. So if you're elite, you're elite. You know that you're just able to push button and deliver whenever you want. There's not a whole lot of companies out there that can really say that or do that. Most of the companies that I talk to, the clients that I'm working with, are usually into this low or medium area, and they strive to be able to get to high. That's where they're setting their sights on, and that's about as fast as the business is probably going to let them move. Right? You got to understand it. It's not a maturity of the DevOps group or the DevOps organization or the development teams. Those guys have the skills and the automation to go do it. It's a maturity of the business, and that's a big thing about what we're trying to do with value stream is help the business mature, help the business understand exactly everything that's going on, how the organization works, and how IT teams and app dev teams are actually creating all this business value. The other thing we care about is, lead time for changes. How long does it actually take to go from code committed to code successfully running in production, right? So we talked a little bit about lead time earlier. MTTR, or time to restore a service when something's broken. How long does it take for us to come back around and actually get it fixed? Is also extremely important in our change failure rate, right? Hot fixes, rollbacks. How often do we have to do those things? What we are starting to realize, and I think is not that surprising, is that the highest performers in these, the ones that are closer to high and elite, are twice as likely to meet or exceed their organizational performance goals. Right? They're the ones that are not only helping transform their businesses that they represent, but the folks that are driving this type of visualization, that are kind of getting the rest of the company on board around value streams, are also the ones that are hitting their personal performance goals. They're the ones that are, getting the pats on the backs and getting the promotion. So it's been a really cool process to watch and start. And it's been really cool to see what everybody thinks they know. The things that, what we call the water cooler conversations, right? Oh, what we just did a release. Where what happened? Oh well, it was went over the weekend, and here we are on Monday. We're still trying to work out a couple of kinks. Those are the water cooler conversations. Once you actually visualize it in a value stream, everyone's having that same conversation, but it's just not at the water cooler. They're having it constantly. They're all over. People get engaged. They get excited about it. All right. So what does this start to look like? If you can take these metrics, and I'll just give you one example here of some groups we were working with. This first team, these are two different teams within our own organization that we were essentially monitoring here. And if you look at the stats, right, like the lead time for this team is heading in the right direction. They're actually delivering much more quickly, and that's cool. But when we look at the deployments that they're doing, right, they have more failed deployments than we would like to see, and they're not very predictable. And then when we look at their throughput, right, what was actually being delivered as part of these various releases, you start to stack it up. They're doing and actually creating more defects that they're having to fix every single release that goes out there. So as a business, what do I do with this? Okay, you're releasing faster, but It's not the best thing that I've seen in the whole world, right? And I can compare that with another team who had a very similar looking decline in lead time. Again, that decline in lead time is from the business saying, look, we need to release faster. That alone will get people to do things more hurriedly, but it won't always have the outcomes that you want. But we see things, happening differently here on the other charts, right? Their production deployments have less failures, and as a trend, their throughput is actually being much more indicative of delivering features than having to go squash defects over time. And is this, I know, is a former development manager of many different teams. I look across and I go, wait a minute, well, what is this team doing that the other teams aren't doing, right? And it makes me want to go and sit down and be part of their stand-ups, get engaged more, understand how they're communicating more effectively, so that as a leader, I can take that and go spread that knowledge around, help other teams improve on a day-to-day basis, right? And you'd be amazed at just how these metrics alone will help people change their actions and help people get on board with wanting to do better, be better in their day to days. Real quickly, again, if you thought this talk was helpful, if you're excited a little bit about value stream management, I put this link back up for you again. It's a free ebook download. I'd encourage all of you to go out there and pull down the book. That's all that I had to share with you today. I'll take a couple of minutes here, real quick. If I got about 4 different minutes, just real quick to see if we have any questions here. So one question was, what is the tool you use to visualize the value stream shown in the slides? It's a good question. If you go to that same link, you'll find more information about the products out there. The one that we were using in that is called HCL Velocity. It's out there. It is free. You can download it. It's designed for a single agile team. At least for the community edition, which is the free one, and it's free for I think 2 simultaneous users. So if you got a 10-person development team, you can pull that down, and your team can use that just to visualize your own flow. It's really cool. Some of the other questions that we had in here: do you work remotely in your company? Do you think remote work lowers productivity? If so, how do you motivate people who work from home? Great question. I think that, and to be real honest, I don't usually work from home. I and my team really value what we call high bandwidth communication, which means face to face conversation. Um, this has been a real challenge for us. These last 2 weeks, kind of being mandated to work from home. How are we communicating? And one of the things we're realizing is what's lacking for us isn't the motivation or productivity. It's just the lack of communication. And so we are really leaning heavily on the visualization of our value streams. Right. When I want to have a phone call with someone to ask somebody about what they're working on, or I have a question about something, the first thing we look at is the value stream. I search for the item that we're going to discuss, and we both look at it, right? And then we're both on the same page right away. And so that's been really helpful. One of the other questions we had was, how would you say is the effect of the current pandemic for value streams? How does one manage such an unexpected change in surroundings? I honestly wish I knew a better answer for you here. I think it's kind of to be determined. But I think the really cool opportunity here for value streams is this is kind of its time to shine, right? This is what it was designed for, was making work visible. And when we're working remotely, there's no better time that we need now than to make that work visible. Um, One of the other questions here, real quick, was it does look like to get available data visualized, you might end up with a custom tool like you'll have to take care of. Can you recommend something? There's a ton of tools out there. There's a number of value stream tools. I mentioned the HCL Velocity. That's full disclosure where I work. But there are several other tools that are out there as well. DevOptics is one that is out there that it's being produced by Jenkins, and I believe that predominantly only works with Jenkins, at least to my knowledge. There's a lot of other tools out there. If you just Google value stream management tools, I'm sure you'll find a number of them. I think Latora from the release management space has a couple of offerings out there as well. So it's a very new and emerging space. There's a lot of different players coming out, and I think over the next couple of years you'll continue to see investment. I know GitLab, I believe, is embarking on their own value stream solution. So, really cool time to be in the development space working around value streams. I want to thank you all so much for having me and kicking off day number two. It's been a real thrill for me. Feel free to reach out and say hello. I'm at Steve_Boone on Twitter. And once again, thank you all so much for spending your time with me. Hopefully, we can connect and meet face to face someday. Take care, be safe, and enjoy the rest of your DevOps Pro 2020 conference. Cheers.